Morning, everybody. I'm going to be placing immunocontraception within the context of broader elephant management, particularly looking at issues around human-elephant conflict. So picking up from Pete's last slide, we're looking at a multiple strategy, and I think that's one of the take-home points is that it's not used in isolation. If we were to look at Africa as a whole, well, there might be a general trend. We want to increase the number of elephants overall, so what are we looking at reducing them? Well, within that context, even with a desire to increase them, there's going to be certain areas where we would need to limit them in terms of numbers or geography. The starting point would be immunocontraception has a value within that. So it's a strategically placed tool that we can look at. So looking at immunocontraception in itself, it's really it's got to be looked at in terms of a matrix of a whole lot of other activities that take place that are of economic significance or social significance, political significance, and all of these, they interrelate in a really complex and complicated way. If we were to view these and say, well, how many of these are directly affected by human-elephant conflict, we would see that it's actually an alarming number. Just to stress that the examples that we've looked at so far are all South African. The context that Pete was talking about with the Tala Game Reserve has slightly broader applicability in that we have an unfenced boundary, so we are looking at something that has broader context in other parts of Africa and, as we'll hear later, India. The other thing I want to mention is just that this is both complicated and complex. In order to get through this, I'm going to have to make some pretty broad generalizations through it. But one of the things that certainly adds to that complexity is other work that's been done on elephants, which really, the biological work has led us to believe that we are dealing with a highly sentient being with extensive consciousness, self-reflexive consciousness, the capacity for empathy, and this plays a role in that it brings in moral judgments around whether we can deal with these things in a historic mechanistic manner. The old Cartesian approach that the sound of a screeching animal is the malfunctioning of a machine is inapplicable for everything. It's certainly inapplicable for elephants. So that means whenever you're going to be dealing with issues where there is a debate around a non-lethal or a lethal management mechanisms, the nature of elephants has shifted it towards the other, and that has an influence in terms of the applicability of immunocontraception as a management tool. As Pete's already pointed out, this is the southeastern part of Africa, and so there's a Tala Game Reserve there. Some of the other work that I'm doing is looking at potential linkages between these and expansion of Tala Game Reserve comes into that. Tala itself is a mountainous reserve. There's 1,000-meter elevation within the reserve. So the south has got this high-ridged mountains, rolling hills that head down towards the Pongola River, which, as Pete's mentioned, is unfenced, and we have a lot of wild country on the other side. The slide doesn't really show it, but as you get down into that woodland, it's very, very thick, so that often encountering elephants is quite close in at the last minute. So there's a closer look at our reserve. The brown dots here would represent homesteads. The initial count of that, we sort of worked out we were dealing with, from a community perspective, about 5,000 homesteads and about 26,000 people. The critical thing here is that the Tala Game Reserve is not a state-owned park. It's a privately owned park by communities. And the history of that is checkered. Like with most African countries, we've had a long history of colonial occupation, and that in South Africa's context was morphed into apartheid. And within those systems, conservation was very often used as a mechanism to remove people from land and This has resulted in a distinct lack of trust between communities and conservation agencies. In some cases, it was just complicated. In some cases, communication had broken down altogether. So in addition to the communities, there are actually 2 communities that own Etala Game Reserve. In addition to them, there are 6 communities north of the Pongola River that are very definite stakeholders. The areas that Pete was talking about, where the elephants drift over every summer for their test series, is this area here. And of course, that can lead to some kind of conflict. So this is where our elephants should be. If we look at the collar locations, we see that they're heading north and east and west. So in terms of developing a strategy for the park, one of the things which we've tried to look at in this, with this complexity, the social complexity in terms of antagonism between stakeholders, the biological complexity, the other components in terms of creating potential corridors, and also looking at other priority species, or priority vegetation types. We've sort of got a zone of influence around the park which is fairly large, and we refer to that as the Greater Etala Complex. So interventions that we're planning tend to be at that kind of landscape level rather than just focusing on Etala Game Reserve as itself. So focusing more on the human-elephant conflict, if you do a Google search for human-elephant conflict, you get 2 definite themes. The one is damaging crops, and in communities where agriculture is critical, the human-wildlife conflict is incredibly serious. And again, Etala with an unfenced boundary is subject to that. And then, of course, we've also got the direct confrontations between human beings and elephants, and Saman's going to pick up on that later in the next presentation. So really what we realized we had to do, there was a number of interventions which we tried and failed, so we did a series of rethinking and reinventing and stealing and borrowing from projects across the world, really. And one of the things that we realized that we had to focus on particularly was the antagonistic relationship with stakeholders and people north of the river. So we started to embark on a very active community engagement process, both using formal meetings with traditional courts, traditional councils, and also more informal meetings, sitting under a tree and talking. The thing I'd want to stress here is that this wasn't like a 3-month community engagement process. This involved full-time staff, varying between 2 and 30 staff members, and it's 4 years and it's still going. The initial process of that was basically just a deep listening to what their complaints were and trying to get a foundation to build some kind of trust. One of the common themes that kept recurring with all of these meetings was there was amongst communities a very strong desire for sustainability. And their definition of sustainability is different to what the UNDP would come up, but it had a very strong emphasis on self-determination, particularly around food security, social security, and environmental care. And that was the issue. There was a very deep desire to look after the land and value the land. As Pete pointed out, much of that area directly north of the river is uninhabited, but that doesn't mean unvalued. What we found was that there was an absolute desire for a conservation-based land use, but it would be defined in a different way. And the social relationships and the need for ecosystem services, providing things that they needed for their lives, that was critically important. But probably more important was the division between those is synthetic amongst community. Those things are absolutely interrelated. And that interrelatedness, that need for how they define sustainability, reopens the idea of the protected area concept. It's possible to have this relationship without the antagonism towards nature conservation that has been a historic reality in these areas. But I would say within that, there is going to be probably a radical evolution of the protected area concept and there needs to be a kind of flexibility around allowing that to take place. But that's absolutely inherent in terms of in terms of how these communities are going to be in favor of allocating a conservation-based land use, which is going to allow greater space for elephants and ultimately other animals as well. The communities that we were looking at, the culmination of the 4-year process that we're in now, the communities are poor. In spite of that, and perhaps because of that, there is still a suspicion that they're going to lose land as a consequence of a conservation-based value. But in spite of that, there's a vast support for a conservation-based land use amongst those communities. So in terms of how we were going to think that through, the conventional thinking, which is, has its roots in the Rio Summit and the United Nations Development Programme and even South African law, was not trusted by community members who still saw these mechanisms as resulting in the poor losing their rights and the degradation of the environment. So the process of that deep kind of working with those communities over a long time resulted in them perceiving the parallels between social justice and ecological justice. And that's something which we're kind of moving forward with. They define that. What they want in their communities is a strong local economy that's based on the existence of a conservation-based land use. And that's sort of the long-term 20-year plan, which is, in order to implement it, we've got to have a short plan, and the short plan is about empowering communities and securing their land tenure. It's about acknowledging the human-wildlife conflict issue, particularly with elephants, and it's about creating opportunities for them to benefit from a conservation-based land use. So where do we sit with that? The issue there, the long-term plan that the communities have for their own future is dependent on a conservation-based land use. That means more space for elephants, basically. And it's dependent on an interim plan which has two distinct parts. The one is pertaining to restricting elephants to the allocated area that they're looking at, and then the other one is the containment, the reducing elephant numbers, or restricting elephant numbers. So what we're working with at the moment is each of those 6 communities north of the river are allocating an area that they want as a community-based, as a conservation-based land use, and we're in the process of designing where we're going to put a 2-strand fence that just restricts elephants. Doesn't restrict anything else. They still have, the land use stays the same. You can have cattle. It doesn't restrict people. It's just restricting elephant at this stage. But it's allowing in the future the possibility of a more comprehensive conservation-based land use. And that's why we refer to it as the interim plan. Essential to that, and you've got the critical point in this, is that 4 years ago we had communities that would not engage with nature conservation. That's now shifted out of that, and inherent with that, with regards to constraining elephant numbers within a community-owned area and in line with norms and standards, and one that does create potential opportunities for communities and in a non-controversial manner. It's now accepted within those communities that immunocontraception is a tool, and it's identified as a conflict mitigating tool. So I want to reiterate, that's our little local situation with regards to Atala Game Reserve, but to highlight the fact that in the different countries which have got uncontained elephants, very different habitats, there's going to be a mechanism by which immunocontraception has a role. It won't be the same role as it has in a fully contained population like Hluhluwe-Mfolozi Park, or a partially contained population, but it is. So it's got to be used. It shouldn't be used as a one-size-fits-all intention. And that's it. Thank you.